It is time for us to begin our Bible study. We're in Revelation 17, and we're going to bring the chapter to a close today. Bringing the chapter to a close. 17, we're going to pick up in verse 16. And we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about a woman from the Old Testament that is familiar to a lot of people. And you're going to see that the entire chapter really has been taken from this woman's character, her behavior, her role in the Old Testament narrative, especially as it concerns idol worship. We're going to talk about that a little bit this morning and then move to close the chapter. Lord willing, on Thursday, which we're moving the Bible study this week from Wednesday to Thursday. On Thursday night, Delmer will be teaching. I will not be here. And he will teach his own thing. I'm not exactly sure what that will be as yet. But Sunday, 1 week from today, we're going to pick up in chapter 18. But when you come Thursday, there's going to be the first section of chapter 18 out there for you to have, so you can pick that up, study, and then when we come and meet Sunday, we'll be ready to tackle that first part of chapter 18. So please pick up one of those as you come in on Thursday night. It's good to see all of you here. It's a little cold this morning, but it's going to warm up pretty quickly today. And we're thankful for that. It's been cold in the last week. I'm sure we're looking forward to a little warmer weather. But it's good for all of us to be here to worship and to study a portion of God's Word. Let us begin with a prayer. Oh Lord our God, we're so thankful for who you are and for all that you do. Jesus, we're thankful for your sacrifice on the cross, that you bled and you died so that we could have the forgiveness of our sins. May we invoke our lives as sacrifices to you. May we study and rightly divide this word of truth that's been preserved throughout the last 2,000 years. We are so thankful for all that you do for us. In your name and your holy name we pray. Amen. So, the beast and his allies, they meet for the greatest anticlimactic scene in human history, a battle that does not happen. In verse 14, they will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is the Lord of lords and he is the King of kings, and those who are with him are called chosen, or the chosen, and the faithful. One of the things that we said about this is every time Revelation, not just in this chapter, but in the previous chapter and in chapters before, every time it seems like there's going to be this great battle between good and evil, this is why we call it anticlimactic. It looks like it's building up to something great, and it's just going to be one of those movie scenes that lasts for 30 minutes when everybody is fighting against each other with sword, shield, and everything on. But then it tells us that doesn't happen. Somebody just effortlessly conquers and wins, and obviously in this case it's God. So the anticlimactic rhetoric is used so as for us to understand we should put no value into evil. We should not fear evil, and we should not fear these people because they will be effortlessly conquered by God. He is the one we need to fear. Because when you fight against him, there's really no battle at all, because he's always going to win. He's the undefeated champion of human history. And he said to me in verse 15, the waters which you saw on which the harlot sits, these are peoples, multitudes, and nations, and tongues. This is what makes Babylon so great, right? Everybody comes to it to buy and to engage in trade and merchants. And we're going to read a lot more about this in chapter 18. And when that falls, then all their livelihood falls as well. So that's what makes this harlot powerful. The economic relationship that is shared between her and all the people around her. But we're going to pick up in verse 16. That's where we stopped on Wednesday. Some context there. But in verse 16, look at what it says. The 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot. They will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with fire. And you can clearly see what started out as a relationship to fight against God quickly turned sour. They're turning on each other now. And isn't that what usually happens in the political world, in the political realm, especially with political relationships, not only with one country, but when country attaches to another? You have somebody, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend until we bring that guy down. And then when that happens, then, we'll just all go our own separate ways and eventually turn on each other. Well, that's exactly what's happening here. The 10 horns, the 7 heads of the beast, they come together. They initially enjoy the intoxication of the harlot. They initially enjoy all the things that they will get from her, but then they turn on her. They turn to make her desolate and naked. They turn to eat her flesh and burn her up with fire. And the irony is they gather for God, but before they can get there, they end up eating each other. And that's what evil does. Evil will eventually disrupt itself because evil cannot, there's no unity in evil. There's only division, and there's only going to be division. And whatever unity seems to be there at face value will eventually fall short because there's no rooted identity there at all. Now, this is going to recall a host of Old Testament passages that speak concerning these similar things. This idea is not unique to Revelation. This idea is not unique to the Bible. One of the things that we saw throughout Israel's history, Old Testament Israel, is that they did this very thing. They engaged with their enemies in relationships so that they can take out another enemy that they didn't like together. And when that went sour, they turned on each other, right? Israel and Babylon, they teamed up for a little bit. The Assyrians are coming against us. And God told them over and over again, especially in Isaiah 7-9, to the king Ahaz, he says, look, I am going to help you. Do not trust in the Assyrians. Do not trust in the Egyptians. Do not trust anybody for that matter, but trust in me. Fear not man, but fear God. And what does Ahaz do? He goes and he builds this coalition with the Assyrians and the Babylonians to their downfall. So throughout history, Israel has been turning to the powerful nations around them to help kind of wipe out some of their local enemies, and it never works out to their well-being. In fact, what happens when Israel joins forces with Assyria? Assyria ends up turning against them and destroying them, literally wiping them out like a Holocaust. And Judah does not learn from that. Judah teams up with Babylon for a little bit, and then what happens then? It turns against them, and they did the same thing with the Egyptians. It will just not work. They have the answer right in front of them, right? God. But they choose to give that up for these political alliances. And really what it was, their political alliances was so that they can get better physically. Their entire idea was, we can be a great kingdom again. We just need somebody to kind of hold us over for the time being, maybe loan us some money, and we'll get back up there. When has God ever been concerned with people being politically in charge and being a great kingdom on earth? Look no further than John 18, verse 36, when Jesus would say to Pilate himself, my kingdom is not of this world. And if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would so fight that I should be king. Now, and that fulfills Daniel chapter 2, right? Daniel chapter 2, you got 4 kingdoms. All of them are really great physical kingdoms. The problem is none of them last. The one that does last is the kingdom who is eternal, and he will break all those other kingdoms. But Israel could not see that. They were, as we would call them, short-sighted in God's eternal purpose. And for that reason, these political alliances will turn sour and they will destroy the harlot. And we need to understand this as destroying the economic stability of Rome, the trade and all that stuff. Whatever that was, we don't quite know. Maybe somebody passed a law about something. But the idea was the economy fell first, and then everything just went haywire from there. Any thoughts or comments on that? Steve?
It's easy for us to think that everything in this world continues as is, as we've always known. But as you pointed out, that's never the case. When you're talking about where you live in this country or any
Mm-hmm.
Germany used to be our enemy, now our friend. Japan was our enemy, well, now our friend. China was our enemy, now our friend. Vietnam was our enemy, but now is our friend.
Yeah.
And so this ebb and flow of, and it seems to be, if you look at it, humans need enemies. Countries need enemies. We need to have enemies within our own country, you know. Then you've got two political parties who are always constantly fighting with each other. Nobody's trying to find harmony or anything out there. It seems like we need to have some chaos in our life. Or should I say, Satan likes to have us have chaos in our life.
Absolutely. And that's why Paul's, and I'm not saying that quite a lot of people do this. I don't know if I'm saying we here do this, but 1 Corinthians 1, I think a lot of people tend to undervalue the opening argument Paul's making in that book. Because the argument that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 1 is the argument that will lead the entire theme of the book. There are divisions among you. There are divisions among you. There ought to be no such divisions among you. That's what Paul's argument is. And lo and behold, in chapter 2, all the way to chapter 16, every sin that they have committed, whether it's not believing in the resurrection, or not partaking in the Lord's Supper the way that they ought to, or not giving the way that they were supposed to. I don't know that we could make that argument particularly, but that might have been the case. A man having his father's wife, and they tolerate that. Marriage, divorce, and remarriage, some of them had some questions about that stuff. Attacking Paul's ministry, ridiculing him because he didn't seem to measure up to what they thought he could be. All those things were boiling down to there are divisions among you. If they couldn't agree on Jesus being their Lord and serving Him, nothing is ever going to go right. Nothing will go right. And that, of course, started with His own disciples, did it not? There were even divisions among the own 12. They would often argue with each other as they were walking somewhere, who is the greatest among us? And Jesus would turn to them and say, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. The Gentiles lord it over their people, but you are those who need to serve each other. And of course, He would wash their feet in John 13. And I think it's at that point they finally got it. We're not supposed to be physically trying to one-up each other. Jesus' kingdom is not a physical one. It's about service. And the book of Acts shows us how they all come together in unity. And the thing about that unity with His disciples is they were all from different political backgrounds. Some were Pharisees, some were Zealots. That was kind of the opposite spectrum in that day, kind of like a Democrat and a Republican. And they all came together and they loved each other. And the reason that they did that is because Jesus died for them. They had fellowship with Him. They loved Jesus more than they loved themselves. And when we do that, nothing will come in between us and our neighbor. And we need to take that into consideration here. All right, anybody else on that? Let's spend some time now talking about Jezebel. There are at least 10 similarities between this harlot and Jezebel of the Old Testament. There could be more, but for time's sake, I put 10 in here. Now, G.K. Beale, he does well in pointing out that the imagery here reminds us of Jezebel, and a lot of this is from his list. He'll give a lot more that may be stretching it a little bit, but these 10 are very prevalent all throughout this particular chapter, but also what Jezebel did in her lifetime. And the first one is this: Jezebel is said to be attractive. She is a very attractive woman, and the Bible describes her that way in 2 Kings 9, verse 30, not because it's trying to glorify her beauty, but it's basically saying it's because of her physical appearance men are falling for the idol worship. And the same thing is true here in chapter 17, verse 4. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. Remember what we said about that a couple weeks ago? Women who dress like this, they are trying to cover up what's on the inside because they know deep down what's on the inside is gross and disgusting and nobody will want any part of that, so they mask that with beauty on the outside. And that's what Jezebel did. That's what this harlot is doing. Jezebel is said to be a queen. She's a queen because she marries Ahab, when God repeatedly told Ahab, do not marry that woman. But he did because why? Her physical appearance. She was beautiful. And this harlot in verse 5, look at how she's described. On her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of all harlots. That phrase, the mother of something, means you're the queen of something. She is a queen, just like Jezebel. Thirdly, Jezebel influences idol worship. In 2 Kings chapter 9 and in verse 22, one of the saddest passages you read in northern Israel's history is when Jezebel introduces idol worship into Israel. In 2 Kings 9 and verse 22, when Joram saw Jehu, he said, is it peace, Jehu? And he answered, what peace? What peace? So long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are many. She introduced idol worship into Israel, particularly Baal worship, which was their downfall. That's how they ended up being destroyed eventually. This harlot in chapter 17 does the same thing in verses 1 and 2. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls, he came and he spoke to me saying, come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot. There's the similarity. She's described as a harlot. This woman in Revelation, a harlot, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality. Those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of the passion of her immorality. And again in verse 5, she is the mother of the harlots, the great abominations of all the earth. Jezebel is said to seduce. And a woman, typically like Jezebel, remember she's detracting from the inside, trying to make it all about the outside, she will seduce. And Jezebel seduces not only Ahab, but the people of Israel to follow idol worship. In 1 Kings 21, 25, and 26, the harlot seduces the kings of the earth to be intoxicated with her. I don't know that word has ever had a good connotation to it. The idea of seducing or seduction in the biblical narrative. It always seems to be used in a negative light. And the way it's being used is somebody is blinded. Often a man is blinded by the physical, and he's like a little animal, like a little sheep being led to the slaughter. And that's how Proverbs chapter 5 and Proverbs chapter 7 describes the adulterous woman. She takes that man that was good, and he's married, and she destroys that man's life. He's blinded to the fact that she is the devil herself, all because of what's on the outside. Jezebel seeks economic prosperity. This is one of the saddest stories you read in Ahab's lifetime. There's a man by the name of Nabal. Nabal is Abigail's husband. That's another story. Naboth is the name of this gentleman. He has a vineyard. And Ahab wants this man's vineyard. But Naboth refuses to give Ahab his vineyard. He says, no, this is all I have. You're the king. You can have anything else you want, just not my vineyard. And hey, that's true. If you're the king, you can have everything you want, but just not my vineyard. And I think he realized that and he backed off. But Jezebel saw it. She was there. She saw her husband was disappointed, and she thought to herself, my husband is the king of Israel. If he wants something, he should get it. And so she goes and she seduces Ahab to kill Naboth, to kill the man who, that's all he had, that was his livelihood. And when he is killed, Ahab seizes the vineyard. And it's all as a result of what Jezebel did. Be careful whom you marry. is a pretty good, I think, application of this Jezebel and Ahab story. And God warned Ahab so many times, do not marry that woman. But he did. And look at what it turned him into. The harlot, she seeks economic prosperity. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in chapter 18. Jezebel persecutes God's people. When Elijah has just slain the 450 prophets on Mount Carmel, the Bible tells us that Jezebel wanted him dead. Jezebel wanted him dead, not Ahab. Ahab knew better. When Ahab met Elijah in chapter 17, Ahab said, "Is that you, O troubler of Israel?" In other words, Ahab would argue, Ahab would take it a step further maybe, but he knew his boundaries. He knew his limits. But not Jezebel. Jezebel wanted the prophet of God dead. If it was the last thing that she would do, she wanted Elijah dead. In chapter 18, Elijah becomes fearful for his life, and he's on the run. In fact, Elijah wants to kill himself because he's afraid of what Jezebel will. I want to tell you, if you're afraid of a woman to that extent, that woman is evil. She's something else. And so Ahab kind of removes himself from the scene. Jezebel, look at what it says in chapter 18, verse 4. 1 Kings 18, verse 4. Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Obadiah feared the Lord greatly, for when Jezebel destroyed the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and provided them with bread and water. He had to hide them in a cave from Jezebel because she was slaughtering them. In chapter 19 and in verse 2, Ahab told Jezebel all Elijah had done and how he'd killed all the prophets with the sword. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and even more if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." Understand what that means? If you're not dead by this time tomorrow, I'm going to kill myself. And you know she's not going to kill herself, which means she's about to make this happen. And so Elijah was afraid and arose and ran for his life. And he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. And it goes on. And the scriptures tell us that God appeared to him and he said, "Do you not know that I have 7,000 men who have not fallen down to Jezebel? You're not the only one. Trust in me. I will take care of it." And he does take care of it. Jezebel does sorceries, witchcraft. We already read that in 2 Kings 9:22. The harlot is said to do the same thing. She does sorceries and these witchcrafts, chapter 18. God avenges the blood of his people on Jezebel. In 2 Kings chapter 9, he will avenge the blood of his people, the Christians, in the harlot in chapter 19. The Bible tells us that God judges Jezebel quickly. Quickly. In 2 Kings 9, and this is just a great story, Jehu is the one given the command to go and slaughter the house of Ahab. And usually when you're evil, and you've been evil for a pretty good amount of time, you know that the day will come when you're going to fall, you're going to die, right? And Jezebel realizes that her time is up. And so she jumps down from a window and she falls down and she splatters herself all over the place, and the dogs come to lick her blood. And that was about as quick as it happened. And God took care of her, was the idea. He took care of her in his time, and it happened quickly. The harlot, multiple times in Revelation 18, you're going to hear the phrase, "In 1 hour your judgment has come." Like Jezebel, God is going to judge this harlot in chapter 18 very quickly. And her end will be as destructive as the end of Jezebel. And finally, faithful servants refuse to participate with Jezebel's wickedness. 7,000 prophets of Baal, Elijah, those guys did not fall to her. They were faithful to God. Same thing in Revelation 17. Those who are with him are called the chosen, the faithful, and they do not fall down to this harlot. There are at least 10 similarities. What the Bible is telling us as you're reading this, and I believe that the Christians would have seen Jezebel in this chapter and in the next, they would have feared greatly for their life. This would have been a time where they might have been hiding. They might be thinking, we're going to run for our lives. Maybe we're going to compromise. Revelation chapter 2 and 3, some of the churches had already started to do that. Why? Because when you read chapters like this and you realize the spirit of Jezebel is in this woman, I mean, you better run for your life. But God is giving them a message. I will take care of her. I will destroy her. I will avenge your blood on her. Any thoughts or comments on any of that? I think it's pretty straightforward when you combine the passages from the Old Testament with the New Testament here, and it just lines up pretty good. So that's some of the similarities. Based in chapter 17, verse 16, desolate, naked, eat her flesh. And that's all talking about the dogs would lick up her blood and all that stuff, fulfilling the prophecy that God willed. But look in verse 17. For God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. And I like that verse because it's telling us that all these things are happening according to God's will. They're all proceeding exactly according to his plan. Right? And that's encouragement to me. That's encouragement to these Christians. It may look at face value from the physical realm that this is not what God would want. But God's saying, just wait. This is exactly what I want. They're going to turn on each other. Just you wait. They will destroy each other. They have a common purpose. And by giving their kingdom to the beast, they will destroy themselves. And by doing this, they're fulfilling my word. In Ezekiel chapter 38, with reference to the prophecy of Gog and Magog, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in chapter 20. But in Gog and Magog reference in Ezekiel chapter 38, God tells the Israelites the same thing. Don't you worry about them. I'm going to put it in their hearts to turn on one another. They will end up destroying each other, right? They will stab each other in the back, as it were, to their own eternal condemnation. To me, this is one of the greatest evidences in this book that God sits on the throne. God does whatever he wants. You see that in this verse? God does whatever he wants. These guys picture themselves as gods on earth. They think that they can control their destiny. They think that they can control how everything happens. And then verse 17 tells us, this is all God's doing. Because he sits on the throne. He rules and he does as he pleases. And I like Job here. I think Job's wording of this would be appropriate. I now know, O Lord, that you are God and no man can thwart your will. Job 42, verse 2. God does as he wishes. And there's no man that can say otherwise. Thoughts or comments on that? Steve?
I'll say it. You see it oftentimes in the Old Testament that when God's people are under threat and some punishment out against them, like Gideon, which you mentioned, just the fact that once Gideon breaks fire and shouts, they begin, the armies below begin fighting.
Yes.
So this is
Yeah, that's exactly the similar thing that's happening here. Steve's bringing up the Gideon example in Judges chapter 7, 8, and 9, and 300 men. And the powerful thing about that, too, in that story, which we will mention that briefly in today's sermon, but a powerful thing about that story is they start out with, I think, 32,000 men, and God tells them that's too much men. If they go against the Midianites with that many, they're going to think they won. They're going to think they did it. But I need you to decrease that number. And boy, did they decrease that number. It went from 32,000 to 300 men. And God gave them explicit commands how to go about this battle. And really, they did not lift up their sword. It was so much so about this torch stuff and the pitchers and breaking all these things. And when they did that, the people thought, what's happening, and they started killing each other. And that was all to say God was making that happen. That was the power of God, the manifestation of God's sovereign power. And the same thing is true here, right? Notice, you never see in Revelation Christians taking up their swords to go fight against Rome. You ever see that? Instead, what you hear is, be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Instead, what you hear is, Antipas, my faithful witness, he was killed. Instead, what you hear is in chapter 6, verse 9 through 11, wait a little while longer. If somebody comes to you with the sword, to the sword you shall go. Here is the perseverance of the saints, chapter 13, verse 10. That's what you hear, because the battle and the conquering is specifically for Jesus. You do not take that away from him. And that is why Romans chapter 13 and Hebrews chapter 10 emphasizes that phrase, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. It is not for us to take vengeance into our own hands. It is not for us to go and lift up our swords and physically fight. It is for God to do that. He is the one who will take vengeance in his own time. Our responsibility is to be faithful until the death. He will give us the crown of life. Verse 18, and the woman which you saw is the great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. And just like that, the chapter comes to an end. This once terrifying vision of John comes to what I believe to be a glorious end by telling us that Jesus conquers her effortlessly. She turns against her allies. They destroy one another. God's really in charge of all of this process, and it will work out to a positive end. And this woman, who seems to just be a queen, she seems to be the pinnacle of all things on earth. She is nothing but a great city. And that's not a positive, that's a negative. Because all the great cities in the Old Testament fell, and their fall were great. It was great. That is true for Nineveh. That is true for Babylon. That is true for Assyria. That was true for Israel. That was also true for Egypt. All of their falls were great falls because they were great cities. And the idea isn't that they were just, it's like New York. Okay, that's pretty powerful. They considered themselves to be great, powerful. I am just the best of the best. And God will show them that's not the case. Because in chapter 18, he will move swiftly into this idea of them being destroyed. So this woman, this harlot, she is Babylon the Great. She is the Roman Empire. She is those that stand against the opposition. And I would suggest to you that Babylon the Great is still very much active today. She may not stand for Rome, but she stands for all the world powers that tell us and encourage man to stand in opposition to God, to do everything that would be contrary to his moral will. And as faithful Christians, we need to withstand that and not get caught up with the physical attraction and the physical beauty of all that stuff. Final thoughts, comments, and questions today in chapter 17, what we talked about just now. If not, Lord willing, 1 week from this morning, we're going to pick up in chapter 18, verse 1, and we'll move to tackle the first section of chapter 18. I appreciate your thoughts, your comments, your questions, and your attention.